Hello, everyone. Welcome to our iMotions webinar about VR and measuring anxiety. I hope everyone can see and hear me. We're going to give folks a bit of time to join, so we'll start 2 or 3 minutes after the hour. But while you're waiting, feel free to drop your questions into the question box that you can see on your screen in terms of the GoToWebinar app, and then we'll be answering the questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have anything you want to ask, just drop it into that question box, and then we'll be moderating them during the webinar. So we'll just give people a few minutes to join, and we will also be starting with a quick poll, so get ready to participate in that. It's just to get a sense of what kind of things all the attendees are interested in. And we can't wait to hear from you. And yeah, we'll just give people a few minutes, and then Mike and Tue will introduce themselves. So I'm going to mute myself for the next few minutes, and then we'll start right after the hour. Hi again. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining, welcome to this iMotions webinar about VR and treating anxiety. We are going to get started in just a few minutes to make sure that everyone has a chance to join. But I wanted to let you know that while we're waiting, you can answer or enter any questions that you have for Mike and Tue into the question box that you should see in your GoToWebinar panel. We'll be answering them after we give the presentation. So if you have anything that comes to mind and you want to get asked, then just please put them into the question box and we will get to them. We are also going to be starting with a little bit of a quick poll so that we can hear what you guys are interested in terms of VR applications. So just get ready. That'll be the first thing coming up, and then we'll have Tue and Mike introduce themselves and get going with the webinar. So thanks everyone for joining. We're really happy to have you here. My name's Kate. If you have any other questions, you can also just email us at marketing@imotions.com, and we're always here for you. So we'll give people 2 more minutes to start to join, and then we'll get going. I'm going to mute myself in the meantime.
Thank you, Kate.
Wow, it looks like we're already getting some really great questions, and it looks like people are joining from Switzerland, Slovenia, the US, Spain, Canada, and we're really excited to have everyone here and participating already. So thanks for your great questions already, and we're excited to get started. On that note, I'm going to start our little quick poll just so we can get a little bit of engagement here to see what you're interested in. So you should see in a minute a poll popping up on your screen, and you can just enter which field of interest you are most excited about or that you're working in for VR applications. So I'm going to launch the poll, and I'm going to give you guys about a minute to answer it. So here you go.
Great, thank you, Kate. And as soon as the poll is done, then we'll basically launch into the webinar.
All right, looks like we have about half of the attendees have already voted, so we'll just give you guys a few more seconds to get your answers in, and then we'll actually share the results as well, so you can sort of see where your fellow attendees are aligning. And then we'll try to cater the content, and hopefully we'll have some questions about each of these interest areas. So we'll give 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close that poll. Thank you so much for everyone who has entered, and let's show those results. Okay, cool. So it looks like the majority of the attendees who have answered are in the healthcare sector, but folks are doing entertainment and simulations, as well as engineering and human factors as well. All right, Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Super interesting results. I mean, that also reflects the title of our webinar today, but that isn't to mean that if you're interested in another field, then this isn't going to be exciting for you, because what we'll be telling and showing is, well, as the title says, physiological research in VR using biometric sensors in a showcase into measuring anxiety and predictive behavior. What that means in layman's term is that we'll show you a little bit of a use case where we have collected some data on a person as they're put into a skydiving experiment. But that's later in the webinar. To begin with, we're going to dive a little bit into the method and the project as a whole, and also explain a little bit about the sensors, so that we have an overall common understanding of the different kind of modalities that we'll be showing today. My name is Mike Thomsen, and my co-host here, Tue, will also introduce himself, and we'll take the first part of the webinar here.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tue. I'm actually joining you here as the only person present today in the iMotions office here in Copenhagen. But since Denmark is also in a lockdown, as you can see, Mike is from home. We're going to take you through this little story that Mike and I also presented some time ago at a conference, VR conference here in Denmark in Odense. Yeah, so what we're really trying to get at here is in a way, has its foundation in this project. You can go onto this webpage after the talk is finished, the VR8 project. I don't expect you to read all the text that I put in here. It's merely to showcase that we are working with the University of Southern Denmark on this very exciting VR8 project. And one of the key components to that project is to use physiological or biometric data to drive VR exposures and also repeated VR exposures. So right now this project is in a very early stage, looking at developing the right tools, the right software tools for this. But as you can also see on the right side here, the later stages does involve clinical trials with patients suffering from anxiety, and the project is going to utilize iMotions platform and virtual reality to create environments and conduct repeated exposures to this patient population. So I do recommend you to pay a visit to this page. It's available in English as well for those of you who doesn't speak Danish. But yeah, there's a lot of useful information in there. So that was really just to set the scene and to show a little bit about what we are sort of working with here in iMotions, and it ties in a way into what we're going to present today. So on the next slide here, you can see this is sort of the aim of the talk, right? We, iMotions as a company, we are very much into doing showing stimuli in VR, and that's what I've tried to illustrate here on the left side in the figure, that we are capable of displaying stimuli in a VR environment. But at the same time, the software platform allows you to capture various types of physiological sensors, physiological signals, all in synchrony with the stimulus that you're presenting in the VR environment. So this is sort of an illustration on that to the left. Then on the right side, I don't expect you to fully understand the very complicated figure that I put in here. It was merely an illustration of the mechanics of the whole project, and also what we're going to show you today, namely that we also offer you the capability to build feedback loops, so biofeedback loops, where you can essentially take data, real live data from iMotions platform, do some signal processing, some treatment of the data, and then use that to drive essentially your BI experience. And we're going to come back to that in later slides, but that's essentially the message that we're trying to convey today, is that it's possible within the platform to build these feedback loops of using physiological data to ultimately drive your BI exposure. Now, before we get into that, the next slide here, we just want to introduce you to some of the very sort of common available tools that we see applied in virtual reality research. There are quite a number of tools that you can use to gain additional insights into the emotional state and also the attention of the respondent while he or she is present in the virtual reality environment. So we thought we would just use the chance here also to introduce the audience here to some of the most commonly used technologies that are all integrated into our platform. So we'll just walk you through these methodologies here in the next few slides.
Thank you, Tue. And I'll take the first one here with the introduction to eye tracking. So the first thing you think about when you're thinking about eye tracking is that you're looking for objects, you're looking at what a respondent is looking at. So it's about what elements in your stimulus is attracting attention and comparing attention on one object compared to another object. But when we do this anxiety measure and we look into their eye tracking, it's not only what attracts the attention, it's mainly also what causes avoidance, because avoidance is a major key factor in measuring anxiety and treating anxiety. So we'll be using eye tracking in two different ways when we do something like this. Eye tracking in a common sense, if you've been familiar with eye tracking, this is how eye tracking normally works, right? You have an eye tracker bar mounted underneath the screen with the screen parameters. It's then shining an infrared light into the cornea, and that light it uses this information to establish where you're looking on the monitor. Now with the VR environment, it's very similar. You still shine an infrared light into the cornea, it's just much closer to the eyes, and then that is used to reflect where you're looking through the lens into the VR environment, through the glasses, right? Through the lens into the headset. Now, when we're talking about eye tracking, what we're really talking about is a bunch of gazes. A gaze point or a gaze sample is mainly just when you're looking at anything, it creates a bunch of gazes, or when you're gazing through an environment, you're creating these gazes. And when you're moving from point to point with your gaze, then you create what's called a saccade. Only when you stop to actually fixate on something does the brain process what you're looking at, and that is what we call a fixation. So using that terminology, that's what we use to create the different kind of analytical tools. And the different kind of approaches here that you can see in the iMotions suite is very commonly known as a gaze replay, where we look at the individual replay. We look at the fixation length for an individual fixation. You see some of the fixation a little bit larger than the other one, meaning that they fixated here a longer time. You see they have a number associated to the order where they look first. So we view these individual replays to get an idea of what happened, what was going on for this person. But then we can also aggregate that information. We can aggregate it across to get a more overall sense of what all our respondents were watching. So we could create these heat maps that show that populate all this focus into visual attention, right? So you get this nice image that shows the red area where they were paying the most attention, and the completely green, less green, or the areas where they didn't see anything at all, where they see no visual attention, right? Moving that into a more numerical values, we have something called areas of interest, which is also more commonly called AOIs. And this is when you want to have a more numerical value to your data. For example, you want to know how fast they were at planning a fixation inside your AOI. How long did it take for them to notice this AOI? How long did they spend inside it? What is the ratio between how many of my respondents I in total recorded and how many of them actually saw the object inside an AOI here? So these are the same tools that can be used in any kind of iMotion study, but also in this VR eye tracking study. And as we're seeing here, this is a replay from a 360 video where the respondent is watching this video as he's doing a presentation, and it's about controlling your social anxiety for a presentation, much like what I'm doing right now. You just can't see if my feet are shaking or anything. That's the privilege of doing this over a webinar. What you see in the orange dot here is the fixation point. And as that expands, that means that they're fixating on it a longer time. You see this guy here, he's coming up and he's shouting at you, telling you you're doing a terrible job at presenting. And all our fixation is on this main threat of aggression here. We're watching the person who we perceive to be a threat to us. Only when somebody interacts with them, our main threat, are we actually diverting eye tracking to the different sides here. We're evaluating with our eyes if this person is going to be an assistant to help us, or if it's also somebody we should consider a threat. And when we look at this data in a more spread out review, so this is not only one person, this is not only that replay you just saw, but a multitude of people. When they were presented with this, where did they spend their attention? And they mainly keep all attention on the main aggressor here in the front. There's terminology saying that we become hypervigilant when we are presented with an aggressor in such a way. So that's the common reference is always to the savannah and the lion, the warthog and the lion on the savannah. That the warthog will notice the lion, and it will then decide if it's about to run away or it's about to fight. Like, that's anxiety. That's the amygdala part of the brain triggering the entire body to have anxiety and say, you need to take a decision now. And what we do is we narrow our vision to become hypervigilant of other threats, but also the main target of aggression here. Now, there is of course no kidding a person. They know that they're inside a 360 video. They're fully aware of that. But when you manipulate or you walk an entire environment around somebody, so there's nowhere that's not the environment, they will still have to plant their eyes somewhere. They have to pay attention to something. And as it turns out, their behavior is still very close to what they do in real life if they were inside this, if they were experiencing this in real life. As I said, you're doing a PowerPoint presentation, the slides are going down. You can see how this respondent here is actually paying a lot of attention to the computer, even though he knows it's a video, trying to grasp some kind of information that will save him from this terrible presentation he's doing. And then he's also panning out towards the faces of all the respondents or all the participants sitting there and watching him. And at the same time, you see the fixations going down into the door, seeking some form of release or flight from this terrible experience that he's having of being evaluated. Now, we know that tells us where a person is looking, of course, but it doesn't tell us what they're experiencing. So this is where we use multi-module solutions and other sensors. And on the next, we were going to be telling you a little bit about EDIA, which is also the sensor that we're actually using in the case study later on. And that is Tue who's going to be explaining EDIA for you.
Yes, so electrodermal activity, or GSR, is I would say a key component to most anxiety studies in VR, as EDA essentially is a measure of someone's emotional arousal level. So it's a fairly easy sensor to apply. Most of them nowadays work wirelessly, so they even allow for a quite substantial amount of freedom to move in an experiment, as you would also like that to be with virtual reality. So essentially you mount a couple of electrodes here on the inside and the palmar side of the hand, and that's then connected to a wireless amplifier that would then send the signal to our software platform for storage and then for further analysis. So if we go to the next slide and dive a bit deeper into the EDA signal, what is it really about? I think you don't have to be an expert in physiology for this slide to work, but essentially I think we all have the feeling of when we get aroused or when we experience anxiety that we start to sweat. And it happens to be so that a lot of sweat glands are distributed on the palmar side or the inside of the hands, and that's why we mount the electrodes there. And essentially what an EDA sensor does is that it measures sweat production and changes in sweat production and changes in electric conductance across the skin, and we can then store and analyze that signal, and from that on we can then calculate the arousal level. So I think you all had that experience, in particular me, at this very moment of having sweaty hands, and that's really what we use in the case of the EDIA sensor. On the next slide here, you can see sort of an illustration of what an EDIA signal looks like. For the sort of the novice and the beginner here, it looks just as a curve with some spikes on it. But luckily for you, it's something that we do quite a lot of analysis on in iMotions. And really, to the basics, the EDIA signal comprises of two elements. So there's the dark blue part of the signal here. That's the tonic skin component. That's really sort of slow increases and decreases in sweat production. And also the light blue signal here is usually what we then analyze in the software, and that's the phasic skin conductance response, so the phasic component of the EDIA sensor. And what you can see here is, and we've tried to illustrate that here with the yellow stars, is that you can see these peaks or bumps in the phasic component of the TSR or the EDIA signal. And those bumps we then analyze to give you a measure of arousal. And there are basically two ways of looking at this phasic skin conductance component. Namely, we can count how many peaks are there in a given time period. Usually it's counted as peaks per minute. So the more peaks you have per minute, the higher the overall arousal level is. So usually during rest, people can have anywhere from 0 to 3, 4, 5 peaks per minute. And in extreme high stress conditions, you can have as many as up to 18, 20 peaks per minute. And then we can also we can analyze the size of individual peaks, and that size, the amplitude of the peak, also gives you a measure of the intensity of the emotional arousal level. And we're going to illustrate this in one of the next slides with some data that we collected during virtual reality. First of all, I want to share with you a few slides on EEG. Actually, some of the early studies that was done using our platform utilized EEG measurements to try and derive or try to have additional insights about the brain state of the respondent that was exposed to a virtual reality scenario. So actually, measuring EEG is not something, or electric brain activity is not something new. That technology has been around for almost 100 years now. What you see here on the right side is one of the first attempts to measure human brain activity. This was done by Hans Berger in Germany. I think it was in 1925. Sorry, he measured the electrical activity of his son here, and the only thing that he was capable of measuring is a very predominant waveform that you see in the human EEG, namely the alpha waveform. That's around 8 to 12 cycles per second, and you can see the technology that he had here was a sort of very large piece of equipment, and he then plotted the sine wave for reference, and that way he was actually he made the conclusion that the predominant waveform here of the human brain activity was the alpha waveform. But in the recent years, the technology has improved quite a bit. So in today's research, we don't need these huge amplifiers. There are small portable wireless EEG amplifiers around that can sit on the back of the VR headset, and then you mount small electrodes to the scalp of the respondent, and in that way you can very easily measure brain activity. And also, as computer processing power has increased quite a lot, if we look at the next slide here, we are now possible to do a lot more than Hans Berger did back in the days. So we have realized that the human EEG is not only basically an alpha waveform, it behaves somewhat similar to light. There are a number of different frequency components in the broadband EEG, and that's what I've tried to illustrate here with the sort of the Pink Floyd cover. We can actually use computer power and computer algorithms to split and filter the EEG signal. And it happens to be so that different waveforms or different wavelengths of the human brain activity actually signals different aspects of brain state or human behavior. So if you look at some of the very low frequencies in the EEG, that's usually associated with sleep or meditation, whereas if you go to some of the higher frequencies, the alpha and the beta, and also in the theta band, they signal cognitive workloads, memory processes, attention, concentration, motivation, and so on and so forth. And in the platform, in iMotions platform, we deliver you these different power spectral densities, so these different wave components, and they're there for you, and then you can use that to analyze and gain more insights into the brain state of the respondent being immersed into virtual reality. Yes. Let's move on to the case study here that Mike and I will present.
Yeah.
Mike, I don't know if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, I'll just get us into it. So as I mentioned, we won't be using EEG to that extent in this case study. We will we'll be showing you EDA data recorded inside a 360 video. We did it on 8 different people just to get a more wide view of the data. There will also be eye tracking, which we also do a little bit of reflective behavior analysis on. But the main part here is the EDA data, because the EDA data is what we use to kind of determine a person's anxiety. It's what we use to determine if they're having a high experience or a low experience, a high amount of anxiety or low amount of anxiety. And the goal is here to see if we can see the difference in the EDA data between what we first going to show our respondents is a calm environment and then an exciting environment. Now for the respondent, of course, the goal is to reach a form of habituation with the environment. It's very important that when we talk about anxiety, that it's not a purpose to cure anxiety. Anxiety is not a bad emotion or a bad reaction to something. You're supposed to be afraid of things that can hurt you. But having an overexposure to it that can either lead to a panic attack or can cause social limitations for you is what we consider a bad thing. If you simply can't go out into society, you can't do certain things because you're paralyzed by fear, then that becomes a problem for you. And that's what we mean with trying to treat social anxiety, for example. Now, what we're looking at is trying to create kind of this Goldilocks scenario for people. We want to expose them enough that they have reactions. We want to expose them and see their reaction to it, but we don't want to flatten the curve completely. And excuse me for my corona terminology, but we do want to decrease the curve to amount that they can actually manage to get through the entire experience without pulling off the headset or closing their eyes. So that's also a way to use eye tracking, because one of the important factors in exposure therapy is avoidance, as I mentioned earlier. The thing that you want to have your respondents be able to achieve is to not avoid their object of fear. Is it a spider? Is it heights? Whatever it is, they should be able to confront it and deal with it instead of becoming paralyzed by their own anxiety. And that's what we're trying to help gain some numerical data insight into, and also to use that data for a purpose, which we're hopefully going to make much clearer now that you see a replay and how we're going to do that, because that's the data loop. Which Tue, you want to explain that?
Yeah. So I think this is what we're trying to get at, essentially. This is one of the main slides that we have for you here, is that I think if you just run a normal VR paradigm, you run the risk of doing exactly what Mike suggested here in the previous slide, that you might end up in a situation where showing the same stimuli over and over again is simply too much for the respondent, so that they simply decide to move completely out of the VR environment. So we need something a bit more clever. We need to manipulate the VR experience in a way depending on the respondent's own physiological status. And that's what I've illustrated here, and also what we're going to illustrate in the next slide, that it's actually possible with the current status of our software to not only record data in the platform, but actually to send that data somewhere else and then do real-time processing. So essentially creating a biofeedback loop. So the case that we're going to show you in the next slide essentially is a recording of EDA activity, of galvanic skin response activity, but at the same time we're streaming that data out of iMotions platform, doing a small piece of analysis on it in MATLAB, and then we're actually shooting it back into iMotions. That's sort of the very first step here of creating a biofeedback loop. And then we can then, in one of the next slides, or in a later stage of the experiment, we could then use that online feedback to do something to the VR paradigm. So here is a very sort of simple illustration of that. So in the lowest green curve here, or the signal that you see, that's the EDIA, that's the galvanic skin response data that we have captured. That's the data that we have stored in the platform. And if you look at the signal here, it's sort of very clear that during the first few minutes of recording, there is hardly any galvanic skin response activity. There are only a few peaks per minute, but then as we change the scenario here and move the respondent into this, I would say quite anxiety-provoking scenario where you're basically being thrown out of a plane in a 360 video, and it really feels like you're skydiving. You see the immediate increase in the galvanic skin response, and you also see that the number of peaks increase quite dramatically. Now, what we've done in this case is not only to sort of analyze the data after we've finished the experiment, but actually analyze the DSR data in real time. And that's what you see in the two top curves here. So the middle the middle green is actually a measure of the size of the individual DSR responses. That's the amplitude of each peak. And in the top curve, you also see a measure of how many peaks are there within a given time frame. So again, this is a very simple illustration of what you can do with the platform, but we could then choose to bring these data forward, the peak count and the amplitude of the peaks, and then start to manipulate the virtual reality based on these online calculations that we have done. And it's a very simple feedback loop that it took Mike and I about a day to create in MATLAB, doing real-time analysis on galvanic skin responses.
Yeah. So I also, just before we move on to the next slide, wanted to mention, because we also we did use the eye tracking, but more as a what kind of insights could we gain from the eye tracking? Is there any form of behavioral traits that we can use for this? And what we notice is, for example, as you see right here, as I go back again, is that the person has a hard time fixating on the ground. To be honest, the ground becomes such a massive thing, and he has an issue creating a fixation point. So what you see with your respondents is that they will constantly try to find some object that they can use as an anchor for their eye tracking. A lot of the people that we showed this to, they all started actually turning around from the ground and looking back up, just to try and find some kind of object that they could anchor all of their eye tracking into. You can see the respondent here is constantly searching out in the field of view towards the other jumpers, trying to fixate on them actually. So there is a way to control, if you control the entire environment, which is the beauty of it. That's what you do in a virtual environment. If you create it all from scratch, you can control everything that you're showing to a person. And you can control exactly what they're supposed to fixate on, if it's meant to help them or if it's meant to even invoke them even further. You have full control of these elements, and you can test via the eye tracking to know if it's working. Now, when we did this, we wanted to use the EDA also. That would be the next step, right? So we have this, as you saw before, this data loop graph where we're sending EDA data out of iMotion. We're calculating it live. We're getting the amplitude. We're getting the peaks per minute. We know if they're reacting more right now, and we know if that reaction is more significant than it was before to whatever else caused them to have anxiety. Now, the next step would be to send that into the Unity environment to make decisions. Because you know how they react in a calm environment, you know how they react in an exciting environment. Now it's all about finding that Goldilocks period of time and keeping them within that, so that they will eventually reach that habituation state with their anxiety-invoking material, right? So let's imagine, and this is where it's not just healthcare. This is anything basically you want to do in control in an environment, because it doesn't need to be anxiety. But that's our main focus right now. So let's say that you wanted to, what could you imagine could cause less or more anxiety? You could turn up the music, you could change the lighting, you could prompt them out of an environment into a new environment. You could, if it was a 3D rendered and not a video, then you could add more elements into the environment. You can make people more aggressive, your avatars more aggressive towards the person. You can increase and descale, constantly reevaluating the person based on his own data. Now, of course, that doesn't need to be completely automized, everything. You could just send out commands to the observer saying the person is overexposed, the person is underexposed, the person is experiencing high amounts of peaks right now, the amplitude is very high, he is reacting more than he did previously. decrease, increase, constant re-evaluation of the experience as it's going along based on that individual person. So it's not about creating a huge database of how people respond to elements, because we're using your individual data to customize your individual exposure throughout, if it's an anxiety treatment or it's PTSD or even if it's just a game that you wanna know if it's exciting for a person, if they're actually being freaked out. You can imagine a Resident Evil game in VR and causing all of those peaks. So that's just a way that will be the next step of like putting that into a Unity engine that makes environment decision based on the data-driven, biometric data-driven. And that could also be done with EEG, right? You have motivation, concentration in your EEG data. Now, when we looked at our respondents, because we as researchers wanted to know if people were actually having a difference in people, is this just a one-off, or could we actually see people reacting differently in the experiment? Were they having more peaks and more amplitude in the calm environment versus the exciting environment? And they all around all our respondents were showing a significant difference in each of them. Now it has to be even mentioned that these people weren't somebody that was selected based on their fear of heights. These were just ordinary people. So you would even imagine if you've exposed this to somebody who had a fear of heights, or had a fear of flying, or fear of skydiving, or fear of dying in general, would have even more peaks in these kinds of environments. And that's mainly what we were trying to do in a more global fashion. Next, Kate will just explain a little bit about, if you want the references, everything. We're scientists, everyone. So everything we've told you today is of course backed up by references and research. You can actually download that from the handout, and we also put in a flyer for general VR with iMotion information that you can download. We would love to hear your opinion, and if you want to know more, then we put in some contact information. Kate, would you fill in the information gaps here?
Yes, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Tue. I'm going to, in a minute, launch another quick poll just to close out the participation, so that if you're interested in having us reach back out to you, we have a few options in this poll. So I'm going to launch that, and then after a minute, we will surface some of the questions that you guys have been asking. I've tried to aggregate the questions into some categories. So I realize that we're a little bit over time. So if you do have to drop off, just know that you will be able to receive the recording, so you'll see the rest of the presentation if you have to go. But let me just launch this quick poll, and remember, you can download the handouts and you'll get the recording afterwards. So we would love to hear how we can get in touch with you. Okay, we'll give you about 30 more seconds to answer. And if you wouldn't like any contact at all, you can feel free to select that last question or just not answer the poll either. Okay, and I'll give you a couple more seconds, but while we're answering the quick poll, I'll just prep Mike and Tue with the first question. So we have attendees who are asking about feedback loops. What is a feedback loop? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And what kind of biofeedback devices are actually using to create these feedback loops? For example, we have one attendee who's building a well-being platform using biofeedback and is wondering whether you'd be able to measure mood, for example, with these methodologies. So just would love to know a little bit more about feedback loops and creating those loops with biosensors. And now I will close the poll and we'll get to it.
Yeah, I can.
Do you want to elaborate too?
Yeah, I can take the first on the feedback loop. So historically, feedback loops or biofeedback loops have been used to. There's been examples of people using EEG activity to feedback directly to the respondent, and based on that, you would be able to actually if you look at how much alpha activity or how much gamma or how much activity you have, actually you can sort of in real time change your brain activity as you go along if you watch your own signal. I think there's been quite a number of examples of that in the literature. I think here a biofeedback loop is not entirely about that. We're actually using here a biofeedback, so the physiological response that we get from the respondent, we're actually using that to drive, or we would like to use it in final stages of the VR8 project, for instance. We would like to use that physiological data to drive the VR experience. So imagine that somebody is having a very stressful moment. We could then, as Mike explained, actually change the parameters in Unity so that it would either play some calming music, it could turn on and off the light, or we could switch the environment completely into something that would be considered to be much more relaxing. So that's a few examples of sort of a closed loop biofeedback.
I mean, in a sense, a loop is what you're seeing right here. It's data recorded in one place, sent somewhere else, calculated, and then sent back into iMotions. And that's what we mean with looping. We're sending it out and we're receiving it back in. And it's not proprietary to just that sensor. You can do it with basically any kind of information that you want to record in iMotion. Our main source is being a multi-module system that integrates all the different kinds of sensors and even custom events that you could send in from different places. If you get into contact with us and you're interested in these kinds of data loops, then that's definitely something we can elaborate on how it's technically actually done. It isn't super advanced. It's a little bit of scripting, and then you're off sending your data different locations. I would say the hardest part about this whole setup is building that Unity environment that you're dreaming about. That is, of course, like the thing that will fulfill your dreams is the difficult part. Everything else with the data loop, making the decision is more straightforward without underselling it.
Great. Thank you for answering that one. Just turning my screen on. Okay, next question. We are having some attendees asking about EDA activity specifically, and if there's a particular reason why we choose to use the finger rather than palm or wrist, and are there other convenient locations? For example, we can place the sensors. And then follow up to that, how do you sort of normalize based on some baseline? Is it per person? And then how do we eliminate artifacts and noise from movements? Analyze this afterwards.
Yeah, I'll take that one, Kate. I think I've just looked through the questions here. There's quite a lot of questions touching sort of the same. There's also some concerns about latency. So yeah, where should I start off? I think, yeah, in general, Mike and I have discussed this multiple times. If you are to run like this in a really controlled, sort of elegant fashion, you would need to have a baseline scenario because each individual response would be different on a baseline. So if you are to do this real, then you need some kind of individually adjusted baseline, since everybody's baseline response will be different. Some can have, you know, a few peaks, some might not even have any peaks, and they can also vary in size. It's very individual. So you would need to have a sort of a baseline. What you also have to consider here, and I saw Sarah, you asked that question, there is certainly a latency. So whenever you experience something, that can take anywhere from 1 to 3, 5 seconds before it actually shows up in the EDA. And since the EDA is actually a fairly slow signal, you actually, and you could also see that in the video that we played, we actually need around 15, 20 seconds of data before we actually start analyzing. So there will always be a delay between what the person's experiencing now and what we can actually use as a biofeedback, because we need at least 20 seconds of data for any sort of meaningful real-time analysis. And that's obviously a concern or a problem for EDA, that it's a fairly slowly moving signal. So there will be some latencies. Touching on the question where to place the electrodes, we know that the hand or the inside or the palmar side of the hand is densely populated with sweat glands. So that's why we tend to use the electrodes there. Now, it can be a problem if you're using your hands in the experience. There are other recommendations to have either a wrist or shoulder placement of the electrodes. Then you just have to accept the fact that you get a little less signal, but it is possible to place them in other places if you plan to use the hands in these type of experiments.
Great. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. Now, a question about heat mapping and attention. What do you infer from a red hot area alone, and how can you know if the experience is positive or negative without extra supportive data points such as EDIA? So to conclude, can you analyze an attention heat map in isolation, and is that misleading?
Do you want to explain to, or should I?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, to be completely honest, you don't know from eye tracking if something is positive or negative. The eye tracking is only the attention. The red area means that, of course, the gaze intensity. The whole point, actually, of doing something multi-module where you're applying different kind of sensors is to have additional information about the respondent. And exactly something like, as also was mentioned before, mood or positive and negative, that's exactly what the point is to using other sensors as well, because you can't, eye tracking isn't natively a good or bad or positive or negative experience from what you're fixating on. You can imply certain conditions, as if they're looking at a kid smiling, then the social conduct of that would be that it's a positive reaction to it. The reason it's positive while they're fixating on it. But any kind of assumption on positive or negative based on eye tracking is going to be based on social conduct.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So we have it's 3:45 Copenhagen time, so we can keep running if you guys want to take more questions. Otherwise, we're happy to follow up with any questions you might have afterwards, and you can email us at marketing@iMotions.com, and then we can get those questions over to Mike and Tue. Yeah. But do you want to take maybe one or two more? Is that fine with you guys?
There are so many questions, so many good questions. To be completely honest, we were afraid that we wouldn't get any questions at all. So this is kind of really exciting. But Tue, you have a super good question. I've read here.
No, I think there's a couple of different questions about using other types of biometric data to create these feedback loops, particularly around the case of EEG. I think EEG has the advantage of being temporarily a much faster signal, so you get almost like you sample it very fast and you get an almost instantaneous response in the EEG. So it's attractive for creating these very short latency feedback loops. You still though need at least a couple of seconds of data to get a reliable estimate of sort of the brain state. And then I think another issue that you might experience with EEG is that it's quite exposed to noise, either from movements of the face or simply the VR headset itself. So I think if you want to try and go for EEG as a biofeedback, then you probably have to do some more sophisticated data cleaning. Actually in the experiment I showed you here, I did some additional artifact cleaning in MATLAB before actually analyzing the EEG, so the EDIA. But I think if you're going with EEG, that's something that you need to explore more. There are other examples in the literature of people using heart rate, which is less prone to noise errors, using that to drive feedback loops, also heart rate variability. So there are a number of different examples of, and it really depends on whether you want to measure arousal. Then it's definitely more than the heart rate, GSR domain, and if you're going for brain states, then you need to take into account something like EEG, and then eye tracking could potentially also be used to drive VR experiences. Looking at one side would trigger something, looking at the other side would trigger a different thing. That's also another example of a biofeedback loop.
Just about the clean data too, because using EEG, right, you could get something very valuable, motivational based narrative if you're doing frontal asymmetry, and that could be done with a relatively simple setup of just 2 to 4 two sensors on your forehead, which most of the VR headsets actually allow for, having well, if you have a high forehead, huge forehead such as myself, I can actually apply sensors up here to measure EEG and create frontal asymmetry to gain kind of this, am I positively motivated towards this choice, or am I negatively motivated towards that choice? So you can, which is personally one of the things I consider closest to kind of the mood or positive negative towards content. Am I looking down two different roads? Which road am I feeling motivated to doing, actually, to choice-based narrative? But of course, there is the outcome of having to, you should be careful about your data. You should know what clean data is and what noise artifacts you'll be creating. We do have some articles about where to place sensors for GSR that mention about that we do it on the fingers. We do. Kate, can you remember where we have that? Because we do have like
I can put that. Kate, I can just give that to you.
Yeah.
15 different points or something on the body where you can place GSR sensors, and which one is the one most recommended, basically.
There's one more thing that I would like to add here. I also see that come up in the questionnaire here quite often, that somebody is requiring like more detailed information about the API. I cannot promise this, but we are, and that's me and one of my other colleagues, we are planning on later during this Corona crisis to have a more advanced session, a webinar on the specific details of the iMotions API. So I think in that webinar, I would dive more, in detail into the code and give you all the examples of sort of scripting code examples for Python and MATLAB that could be used for this.
Great. Let's.
Is there any more question you think we should do now, Kate? I mean, we really want to answer everyone, but then you'll probably be stuck here for another hour.
Yes, let's just take one final question. I'm just reading. There's some questions about Unity and how iMotions actually integrates with Unity. Does it use a plugin? What's the sort of the setup there? And how do you create an experimental design inside using Unity?
How do you create an experimental design inside Unity?
And then integrate with iMotions.
That integrates with iMotion. That's a great question, because that is both the difficult thing, but it's also the exciting thing. Because if you create a full environment, then you put in you create, of course, your environment. Then you put in the iMotion plugin, and you put in a plugin that or an asset, as it's called in Unity, a Unity asset for communicating with headset, and an iMotion asset that communicates with iMotions. And both of these assets is something that we would provide you with, that you drop into your environment, and then we go through setting that up together. So the only thing that really you need to be concerned about is creating a 3D environment. But once you have that, then you have eye tracking inside your environment. So you can actually build, as Tue briefly said, triggers or information-based things that can happen when you look at stuff with eye tracking. So when I'm watching that element, should some information pop up? Should it increase in size? Should it be highlighted, or should I actually be able to use it for game mechanics, the eye tracking? When I look at something, then it highlights and I'm able to interact with it. If anybody's tried, not to go with commercial, but there is for example, a new VR game called Alice. It's using sort of hand tracking that points towards an object. And when that object is highlighted, you can interact with it. You can do a certain movement that pulls the object towards you. You could do the same thing with eye tracking. If you were to look at an object and do a command with the hand, then that object would fly towards you. So you can use these kind of assisted mechanics in a gaming environment with using eye tracking. The things that we help with, of course, is applying eye tracking inside the environment, so you can communicate with the headset, and then forwarding that information into iMotion so you can do the analytical part. And then what's up to you, again, as I said, is creating the actual environment. Was that an answer, Kate?
Yes.
I hope that sufficed.
And I can see all the requests here for an API webinar, so I'll definitely try to convince Ole that we should do. And I can tell you right now, it's probably going to be a mix of MATLAB, Python, and Unity. So everybody stay tuned. I'm sure that Ole will be happy for the feedback, and I'm trying to twist his head, and let's do that. Yeah.
Just as an end note, all of our different modalities have a dedicated pocket guide, as we call them, on the website that can be downloaded. you can also see more about the next upcoming events, the next webinars, which is already tomorrow at 6 o'clock European time. So you can always gain anything that we show is information available on our website, or you can contact Kate, and then she can help you out definitely, the marketing team. But join in for our next webinar tomorrow, which is with Dr. Jessica Wilson and Robert Christopherson, who's going to be doing a crash course in a business case, if I remember correctly. Is that correct, Kate?
Yes, bringing neuroscience to business schools.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So yeah, you can sign up on iMotions.com/events for all the upcoming webinars. We will have more, including the API one, scheduled soon, and we'll send those out in an upcoming newsletter. So make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter. And if you'd like to actually request a personalized live demo for your use case, I see a few people requesting follow-up contact information, and we will definitely do that. But if you'd also like to submit a demo specifically through our forms, you can also go to iMotions.com/request-demo, and we'll get that assigned right away. So thank you so much for everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure. And again, you will receive the copy of this recording in about 24 hours. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we're so glad that you all joined us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.